and Estrogen Cold Circle, tell me if I'm wrong, I think it's worth having a discussion as we go through this, sort of, it's worth a little bit of a paragraph by paragraph, point by point breakdown. But really the goal here for me is, what is the underlying thing that Deleuze is trying to communicate with this? And I think it's not necessarily, I think, as difficult as he makes it seem. This feels like one of those where he's really sort of overindulging the explaining what he's trying to say thing, but I really do enjoy it. It's a really fun breakdown. So it's going to be this. I think this might be a fun discussion. So we'll give everyone a chance to join up in just a moment, and we'll get going.
There's always a danger in that, because sometimes Deleuze, it seems like he's overindulging himself in this literary flourish that he loves to do all over the place, but there's also sometimes a point behind what he's doing stylistically, and I can't make heads or tail if that's actually the case in this in this series or not.
I think this one is, and as I was diving into, defining a portmanteau and trying to really get into, like, what is the linguistic argument that's been happening here? I think it was really funny that I ran into sort of throughout the definitions of it that came across on dictionary.com, or, people writing little bits of essays here and there, that are saying, this word or that word is a portmanteau. Words that he goes out of his way to say are not. And sort of separates portmanteau from them. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. I hope. So we'll see. But that's my hope. So, there you go.
To me, it's just portmanteau versus everything else. Like the constructions of the different categories of the ones that aren't measuring up to portmanteau. I'm not sure if that's going to be significant later, or if that's just part of his self-indulgence, really.
I think it's going to be important later, because I don't know. We'll get into it. Fuck it. We only have a couple people here, but I think it's worth it. We got Terrence and we got Derek. We got Estrogen. We're okay here. I think we got a good group of people who I think are going to be able to disagree, and we're going to be able to learn from. So, if y'all don't mind, I think it's time to kick it off. Anyone object to kicking it off? Anyone want to wait? All right, I'm going to take that as we're going ahead. So as always, I want to thank you and welcome you to the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. This week we are diving into the 7th series, that of Esoteric Words. We'll skip announcements today. There's only 6 or 7 of us in here, and we kind of all know what's happening on the server, so we'll skip it today. But I want to dive in because it's, I think, an important one. This is an interesting section. We spent about 3 hours going over it last night, almost note for note. And I think I made the joke at the beginning, oh, go to shorter one. This is going to take forever. And I think that's entirely possible here. So let's go ahead and start with sort of, I think, the first question I have, and it's going to be out to all of you. Oh, we are recording, Derek, sorry. We're recording and we're live across the board. So do be ready. That's happening right now. So everything you're saying is for posterity or for our one YouTube viewer. I know. Be careful. You never know who it is. So the way that this section seems set up, and the concept of esoteric words, and I think the translation here, I'd love to, if anyone, not sure specifically who I might be referring to, who might be able to sort of shed some light on sort of the original French around this, but it feels like this section is about the use of Carolean esoteric words, and Deleuze breaking them up into a handful of sort of use cases, the way that Carroll collapses series or connects them with the use of these esoteric words. And he has a handful of them that he sort of talks about. The first sort of esoteric object, I think, would be the first way that he connects series. He talks through that. The second is having 2 series that are really far apart, but ultimately regulated by propositions. The third, 2 series with an esoteric word that regulates them or comes between them. And then the fourth is the portmanteau. And this sort of transition over time, I think it's the kind of thing we're going to obviously have to get into here, but I'm really fascinated to the bigger idea here. So before we get going, does anyone have thoughts on this series? Before we get started, things you'd like us to keep in mind or general opinions before we dive into each one of these sort of in the order I just said?
I think the big idea is this is where he finally introduces the three syntheses that he'll rework to become the three syntheses of the unconscious. And it's true, he gives pride of place to the disjunctive synthesis, the Portmanteau word, but he does describe the connective synthesis and the conjunctive synthesis, and they're important. And it's good to keep in mind that the very next year, in 1970, there was an article published, the first article by Deleuze and Guattari together, which is called The Disjunctive Synthesis. And he sort of takes up stuff that he puts in this chapter and correlated with what he says in the appendix on Klossowski. And there's a change of tone and of content because it's the article of 1970 called The Disjunctive Synthesis is a sort of a collage of extracts from Anti-Oedipus. But anyhow, this is it seems to me, it's the first time that he's actually names the three syntheses, even if he's developed them in the preceding chapter without naming them.
That's excellent to hear, because as we were reading through this and we kept going, I think that was our sort of conclusion last night, was this is that early sort of throw at the idea of how the three syntheses work, how they operate, what they do with what they will come to call partial objects, but here it's talking about essentially sort of signs and signification and the words within the series. Yeah, it feels like it's directly pointing at that. So good. Yeah, that's was that basically our conversation last night, Cold Circle and Estrogen? Like we were talking about this for a while. That's good. That's good.
Yeah, that was complete.
I don't remember talking about the syntheses. I think that was something that you talked about after I had left.
Well, it was a good conversation regardless. So we'll dive in. Sorry, Terrence, go ahead.
Just a point of detail, there's a big translation mistake in the first paragraph that has a big effect on the sense, and it's 2/3 of the way through. He's talked about the cyclist wounded and then no longer wounded and then wounded again. And he says, it is as if the watch knew how to conjure up the accident. That is the temporal occurrence of the event, but not the event itself. The result, the wound is an eternal truth. So I read that and I thought, that doesn't make sense. He means the opposite. And because of translation experience, I thought conjure is faux ami. It's a word. So I thought to myself, it must be conjurer in French. Conjurer in French means to avoid, to chase away, to almost to exercise. So it should read, it is as if the watch knew how to chase away, get rid of, or avoid the accident. That is the temporal occurrence of the event, but it could not avoid or get rid of the event itself. So I think with that, the paragraph makes a lot more sense.
Interesting. So Let's go ahead and dive in for a second. So the first series that he's talking about here, which relies on this story within Sylvie and Bruno, is the two series that have small differences that have a strange object regulating them. I kept bringing it up as a joke. There's an Adam Sandler movie where he's got a remote that can pause time and skip around and all that. The strange object, essentially in Sylvie and Bruno, because that's like the modern shitty version of Carol's thing. Yeah, Click is the terrible movie. But in Sylvie and Bruno, they come to have this watch that's absolutely awful at telling time, but it does this other really strange thing, where when an event happens, they can kind of roll back the minute hand a few minutes, and everything goes back to that point. The example that's used here is in the first time they sort of explore like using it. They do it in an innocent way, and then they're like, "Oh my God, we could save some people and save some damage, and stop people from being hurt." And the guy sort of goes over, is riding, and he tumbles over. So they go back and they sort of rewind time. And it goes before the accident.
This is such a good part of Sylvie and Bruno. If you guys haven't read Sylvie and Bruno, I highly recommend it. And this chapter in particular with the watch is so good. Sorry.
No, Ben, do you want to finish describing it? Because I haven't read it in some time. Like I binged it again last night. But if you want to dive in.
No, I didn't mean to jump in.
You're good. So what happens is the watch sort of skips back, and then they're able to move the crate that the dude flips over on, and that's great. It's awesome. But then, weirdly, as the watch hits the correct time that they had fast forwarded to, and that they rewound from, it skips back into, if we think about it as branching pathways, it's hard to describe without literally reading aloud the chapter, and I'm not going to do that because it's a bit long. But it kind of skips around the accident and around not the accident, back to the guy now catching up with, let's say, real world, back on the stretcher and heading into the ambulance. The implication there that the watch can reverse time, can change things, but ultimately when you catch back up with the real story, kind of the things reconnect. This gets much more complicated later on. Is that a fairly decent summary there, Ben, of that?
Yeah, it's like this really just dramatic chapter. It's like one of the really few chapters of the book that has like urgency and immediacy to it. Like something is actually happening that needs to be addressed, and this whole scene where they actually solve this problem, and then it snaps back as if they hadn't done it at all,
as if they had never done anything. And that's so the two series in this case are Move the Box, Didn't Move the Box, moderated by the strange object. With that entire thing, and as it's set up, as people sort of look at that, what we see is that in this new timeline, as they say here, the watch knew how to conjure up the accident. To me, the way that this reads is it knew how to avoid the accident directly. The accident itself doesn't happen in this timeline, but the event itself, the result, the wound as eternal truth, happens again. That's the thing you kind of can't avoid. So they're able to skip the accident, but not the occurrence, which is a really strange, sort of extraordinary thing. And so it really helps that that's a fuck up in translation, Terrence, because I was very confused trying to read this last night.
In fact, because for the second one, he talks about a law, the law of divergence. I think the first one could be described as under the law of conservation of the event, or the fatum.
Well, we had a long chat. Is there a way anyone here, does anyone here want to give us a good definition of fatum? Because we had this super deep dive on trying to figure out what the hell exactly he means, because there's a lot of different, we'll say, conflicting versions of this in sort of Stoic writing and history.
Yeah, I was trying to get my head around this as well. My understanding of it is it's to do with past and future. There is an element there. So in this first series, the two accidents, the two ways in which this could have played out. And so there's with the accident and without the accident. Those are the two ways, the events. Those two series which are, what should I say, opposite each other. But the event itself, as he says, the kind of the eternal thing that happens, the result, the wounds, well, as an eternal truth, cannot be changed by this. So I think the fatum, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it, fatum, I think has an idea of, the way I was reading it was past and present as well. That kind of, it goes back to that kind of right at the beginning when Alice is growing bigger and smaller at the same time. So the two things could happen at the same time. So they're both related to the same individual. But the eternal thing, the event, is at the surface, which is the accident.
Yeah. So for fatum, I mean, there's so many different definitions we found in writings and references, and I don't think there's actually papers written on people trying to figure out exactly how Deleuze is using this, which is interesting. But the sort of essence of fatum, as I sort of found it between some writings from Cicero and a handful of others, Seneca, generalized sort of large-scale Stoic thought, is the idea of all the bodies, all the sort of momentum collectively of everything, that things are moving, things are doing what they are, the bodies are doing what they are, and there's an inevitability and a momentum to them, and that fatum is kind of that momentum. Mentioned earlier, as Jack mentions, in Series 2, this is brought up again, and I think we were talking about this last night as well, Estroven, where we were talking about, what is the word? I keep losing it. Pleniment is when this is brought up the first time. To sort of talk about, they weren't necessarily fatalist, that there was this generalized natural momentum that bodies have colliding and doing what they do, but they utilized the term clinamen to be this sort of randomness that is part of the entire thing. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to touch on this a little bit. But as far as I could tell, based on some of the stuff I was reading stuff from Michael James Bennett and of course the earlier series, and as far as I can tell, there's something about fatum that seems to relate to a quasi-causality that is inherent to how the event functions. But again, like digging too deep into it, I don't know how relevant it is to this particular chapter.
I think that's it. Destiny is the word that he doesn't pronounce, but destiny is the realm of causes and of the temporal effectuation of the event, the occurrence, or the accident. That's in the depths. And the fatum is the realm of effects and of quasi-causes.
I think there's a reference to. I was going to say there's a reference to fatum in the fifth series of, and he talks about the word fated, and he says the fatum accompanies the pure event. So I think with the event, which in this case is the accident, you get the accompaniment of the fatum. And he talks about fated and fatum within the kind of idea of modality. And I think the notion here, I think, is that this is the way things, the notion of modality is how things might be. So the possibility of, so the idea of possibility, necessity, and the reality of things. And here, the fatum is that it could be either way. Either way is it's not one way is correct. They're both in a sense fated. So the fatum is the thing that accompanies the event, and the event is the accident, which doesn't disappear, which isn't kind of, which isn't altered.
Interesting. I like that. Please go ahead.
Just one more point on this, but tying it all into modality, especially here when we're talking about minor variations of internal difference between series that is only unified by the strange object between them. The introducing modality here and talking about Fatum, the distinction that he makes in the second series was between destiny and necessity. I'm not sure how closely tied Fatum is to something like necessity, but they probably do serve a similar role in being modal states, I suppose.
Yeah, he actually says it it's in the fifth series. He actually talks about this, the notion of modality. So he's talking about series in terms of modality, and he talks about exactly what that idea. It's how things might be, how things could be. So it's again, it goes back to the beginning of Alice, where she could be small, she could be larger. I think this is where the Fatum, I think, comes about here.
Well, so to me, this is specifically talking about just straight up connection. Ultimately, like we're talking about contractions on a single series, still at this point. And we're sort of starting at that place. So just again to say, because we're trying to head towards sort of talking through these three syntheses as we make our way through, I read this one as being absolutely part of that. It's ultimately contractions on a single series. In the case of the watch, it's contracting sort of a part of a thing inside of a series of events that removes that, but ultimately the event itself, the wound as eternal truth, is still there. So it's almost a contraction inside of two series between the two of them.
Yeah, I think you were asking earlier, Brooks, about the kind of underlying meaning of this, and I think one of the meanings is obviously it's a development from last week when he brings in the idea of serialization, and now he's talking about specific ways in which. So he says Lewis Carroll has a serial method in literature, and he's looking at different ways in which he brings about these series. So in this one, I would say we had a discussion last week about the idea of homogeneous and heterogeneous series. I would say this is fundamentally a homogeneous series. And how do they regulate them? How are they brought into a kind of synthesis, I don't want to use that word, but in a kind of a creative kind of engagement with each other. And in this case, it's through this strange object, this thing which kind of causes the series to reverse itself, not to reverse itself, sorry, no, to kind of replay itself, but with a different outcome.
Yeah, and I spent some time last night really trying to dive through and find more contemporary examples of this, and one that I really liked that I thought through for this one specifically is the movie Groundhog Day, which you could easily think of as essentially two series being sort of conjoined, not necessarily even by a strange object. I think that might be superfluous to the concept, but that the series themselves are being contracted. You have the series of the first day and then the last day, and everything between sort of is an overlay of those, and that we have those two series sort of being mediated. The internal sort of temporal occurrence, the accident, as it were, is sort of, relived a million times or whatever, but we essentially have two sort of series that have that contraction in the middle, and then ultimately only one ending, the fatum at the very end of that, as the sort of two series collide. Just trying to come up with more modern just better ways to describe these things with a little bit more contemporary things. Although I love Sylvia and Bruno, like these are things that occur inside of literature all over the place. And there's a lot of really, really fun sort of versions of that. And if anyone has any, you're free to sort of jump in. But that one I thought was just really interesting because ultimately, again, the fatum that the wound is eternal truth, the finality, there was only ever one ending that could ever occur. No matter how many times anything happens inside of that film, it's ultimately that same singular ending, which is, I think, really interesting to think through. Well, with that, let's move to the second way that two series get sort of manipulated within all of this, and that is to have two series with huge differences, great internal and accelerated differences, regulated by propositions, or at least by sounds and onomatopoeias. The sort of examples he gives here is the mirror or the dream sequences in Sylvia and Bruno, which I think is a phenomenal one. But it's the idea essentially of having, how to even phrase this one? This is a more complex one. We're still in the connective, I think. We're still in the connective. But we're talking about the sort of nature of having these two series that have split characters between them that seem to be running almost in parallel. In the example of Sophie and Bruno, they have a dreamscape where there's fairies and, like, it's a crazy different world that somewhat sort of mirrors. It's a little Wizard of Ozzy, where there's a little bit of mirroring of what's happening inside of the real world, and they're connected by, propositions or by onomatopoeia and, sort of fun words. The human fairy series are split by some words. Is that a decent interpretation of this? Or does someone else want to give a better one? Let's start with that. Does anyone want to give a better interpretation? How's that one?
And I think here, so I'm not going to try and give a better interpretation for it, as I could do that. But I think I think the difference between this and the first one, and again, it's to do with this difference between homogeneous and heterogeneous series. I think this is, I would call this, if we're going to use these labels, probably an heterogeneous series, because he said the two series with great internal accelerated differences. So they have, the first one has minor differences. He calls them slight internal differences, where this has very great differences. But as within all series, the way that Deleuze talks about them, they all are somehow connected to each other. And in this case, the connection is through, or he uses the word regulation, regulated by propositions or sounds and onomatopoeias.
Well, even their onomatopoeias are a little strange, right? Because so it's a sound, but it's a sound as a word, right? So like, if I want someone when reading a poem to make a sound, I write Foosh, right? So there's a way in which like an actual word is created to produce sound.
I think is an onomatopoeia like a sound which is like a name for something. I'm trying to think. He gives an example on page 47. He says the fliz is almost
it's Dr. Seuss. Like, Dr. Seuss is this. I'm reading it to my kid. Like, this is what Dr. Seuss is you have sort of these weird combinations of all kinds of stuff, but the onomatopoeia in words that seem to signify something or sort of point towards it and are purely nonsense. And like, if you want to read Dr. Seuss, I'm happy to bring some out.
Like buzz is an onomatopoeia. Like a bee goes buzz because it goes bzz, like a buzz, or like meow, or like murmur, or those are onomatopoeia.
Yeah, exactly. It's not it's a special type of literary device because you're using the word to produce the sound, right? So like I said, if I want someone to go like they're blowing out a match, I can write Oosh, and that's kind of a soft blow.
So is it not Dr. Seuss?
I'm sure Dr. Seuss uses them. I mean, they're a very fun technique.
Yeah, onomatopoeias are pretty simple, self-explanatory kind of words. I mean, that's specifically what it is. It is what it sounds like. which is why we have the word onomatopoeia in the first place. It's such a very strange word. And you have like comics use these a lot. When we think of like, pow, bam, those kinds of sounds. So
Yeah, that's it. Because like if we put it in this context, right, it's naming a sound, right? So it's like a proposition of a sound or of a form of expression.
I would love, like whoosh and all those are good examples, but I'm going to ask specifically how those involve at all two series. Because that's the use. Like, I know what an onomatopoeia is, but the use we're talking about here very particularly is two series of events with great internal and accelerated differences regulated by propositions or at least by sounds and onomatopoeias. Examples would be...
At the very least, they belong to the series of states of things. In that sense, they're sounds without any linguistic sense at all. And they belong to the series of sense because they are part of language and they have a sense. When, well, it depends on how intelligent you think a cat is, but when something goes splash, and we say splash to imitate the sound, the splash is meant as part of the physical series. It's meant to be a sound that we can recognize. Ideally, someone in a different language than English could recognize it. And it's meant to be a signifier as well with a sense. That's why we get the onomatopoeia vary from language to language, but very often we can recognize them. In French, cock doesn't do cock-a-doodle-doo, but cocorico. But usually with words like that, you can recognize quite a lot of them. Splash in French is splatch with a TCH sound, but we recognize it. So, and others we don't recognize at all. In English, for the sound that a baby makes, I think it's gu and ga. In French, it's are. So the context is going to tell you that it's an onomatopoeia for the sound that the baby typically makes. But that's a big leap from the English, gu and ga.
All right, so
You have a well-behaved baby because here we say wah, right? Our babies are always crying in the U.S. But yeah, to expand on your point, right? So what you're seeing in those series and this law of divergence, so we're seeing how the characters are splitting from one series to another, right? So the use of onomatopoeia, the use of sound here, right? The baby crying and the way that that's happening in sound, but also happening, if we like, with the proposition or the use of the onomatopoeia, right? That's changing the two series, or rather accelerating the differences.
Okay, so I want to pull back a second because, again, the best way for me to understand this, and I'm sure I'm not alone, is to actually come up with actual examples of like what he's trying to get at here. Because we've got a couple different parts of this. So one is two series of events with great internal accelerated differences regulated by propositions. Let's start just there, or even sounds. So he uses the example of Through the Looking Glass or Sylvie and Bruno's dream world of fairies and humans. Conversely, I was thinking, I was talking last night, the film The Never-Ending Story, which is about one world that is ours, another world that's complete fantasy dreamland, literal dreamland, and as sounds happen in one place, they actually happen in the other. The stories couldn't be more different. One is about a world being literally destroyed by darkness, filled with giant rock people and rock children, and tar that eats horses, and all kinds of stuff. And the other is he's in a schoolhouse in our world, like not Fantasyland. But the connection is the sounds, the stories continue to get further and further apart. There is some level of connection there, both in terms of the sentences people say, which seem to cross over, but also the sounds, and there's a handful of possibly onomatopoeias in that. Is that an example of this type of series and this type of usage of esoteric words as he's describing them, or am I off?
Yeah, I think it sounds right, Brooks, what you're saying, because I think here in the second one, you've got two, as he says, two very different series coming into contact with each other. So one is the room, the old room, but then the way it's seen from the inside the mirror. I think that's the scene that's being played out here, I think. And the room itself looks just ordinary, whereas the world from inside the mirror is completely different. So there is something. I mean, it doesn't give an example of this, so we are kind of at a bit of a loss unless we can come up, as you say, come up with that kind of definite example. But what you imagine that these two things are kind of together, and they will be connected by either a sound, an onomatopoeic sound, or a sentence, or something, or a proposition, or something.
Okay, so because the reason I'm having trouble with this is like a comma here changes an entire conversation, and it sounds silly, but if we say, for example, we find in Carroll's work two series of events with great internal and accelerated differences being regulated by propositions, or at least sounds and onomatopoeias, that the works are regulated, the two series are regulated, or is it that the accelerated differences are regulated? Like that to me is like a significant, sounds like silly, but it's a significant difference between the two.
No, I think the idea behind the series, if you remember from last week, is that the two series are regulated by something external to them. So it's always something external. So in this case, the two series is the room and the mirror, the world seen through the mirror, which are in a sense the back of the objects in the room. They're kind of a strange world that's being set up. So they're the two series, but they're regulated. These are the, like in the first one,
are the bodies regulated, or the events and the divergence? So, and this is why his example of Sylvie and Bruno is incredibly unsatisfying to me, because it's very easy if I were to say that, well, actually the two worlds, the dreamland, the fairyland, and the real world inside of those, the literal bodies are actually have this sort of disconnected, sounds or discussions that are sort of regulating the differences between them. That's one way. Or if I were to say, well, actually these sets of bodies, but the events, the changes, the actual like divergences are accelerating, and the acceleration itself is actually what is being regulated by propositions or sounds and onomatopoeias. The second feels like it's more interesting to me, sort of intuitively, but the difference is significant.
Well, I want to agree with Derek, and I want to bring linguistic detail. In the French, I've underlined lots of things in English, but I don't think it's there. After great internal and accelerated differences, in French, there's a comma. So
of course there is.
That makes the being regulated by propositions on the same plane as with great internal differences, and both referring back to the two series of events. Otherwise, there would be no comma if it was referring to the differences.
Excellent. So that's an excellent translation job, because there's no comma in my copy. So
no, I don't have one.
Great.
It's a prepositional phrase though, so I think you can actually get away with not having a comma, because you kind of, since being is doing the connection there.
But it is a bit
the linking verb, right? You have to go back.
Yeah, but you have to parse it mentally then.
Yes,
the normal thing will be for it to qualify the noun just before.
Which would mean we're talking about the differences are being regulated versus the events.
If you don't put the comma in, it can refer to the events. That will be a sort of a mental, or by it will be governed, being will be governed semantically by event, but syntactically by differences, and then you're sort of in a quandary as to which is the governing noun. But if you put the comma in, at least in French, the comma is there, that decides in favor of the semantic governance, that is to say, according to the sense where it normally must be event.
Yeah, can I ask a question, Terence?
Mhm.
The word accelerated, is that a correct translation of accelerated, would you say?
Yes, it's the same thing in French, accélérer. So I was a little nonplussed by what it means. I can only see it as meaning accentuated, but in French it's accelerated too.
Okay.
The acceleration may be due to the fact that the connecting factor is a proposition or an onomatopoeia, and is not limited by the same laws as in the first case with a strange object. But that's just a silly conjecture. So it does shock when it says accelerated.
Yeah.
So and then to just add to that, the having the comma is so great. Okay, so with Sylvie and Bruno, the way that Carol sort of works out, and again, worth reading, the difference between, let's call it real and dreamland, which is human and fairy, the way that it's written. And he sort of mentions it here. He says, Carroll presents a detailed table of states, both human and fairy, which guarantees the correspondence. The transitions from one series to another and the communication between series are generally secured through a proposition which begins in one series and ends in another, or through onomatopoeia sounds would partake of both. The way it's written is sentences genuinely start in one and sort of end in the other, or they have their implication in the other. As sort of the story continues and they move between the two worlds. As Tron, I'm just going to go to Tron as like an example of this, where they have, the whole story he's telling in the beginning has payoff that actually happens inside of the fantasy world, inside of the computer. These kinds of things and the states between them that are very, very clear, it's the still same kind of thing that we're talking about here.
Okay, if you've ever seen that one episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, where Picard is constantly slipping between 3 different timelines, all related to like the same event, and he'll like start saying a sentence in like one timeline, but like finish it aware in another, or like another character will start saying something in one timeline, but it'll cut mid-sentence to like a different character in a different timeline finishing the sentence. And that's like what happens in Sylvie and Bruno. Like there's a character like named Lady Muriel, and like the narrator will be talking to her, and like a line of dialogue will start, and it'll be presented in such a way that you assume Lady Muriel is saying it, but then like at the end of the line of dialogue, it'll be revealed that it was said by like one of the characters that resides in the fairyland half of the story. So it'll be like the like some other character. So like you almost have no idea as a reader when it's slipping back and forth until it already has.
I think I could see that because the fairy world and the... Well, it's weird, right? Because the fairy world and like the other world here, he's talking about them as states, right? So he's talking about what sounds to be like being, or at least bodies, if nothing else, right? States of affairs. So you've got the table doing the governance, right? But it sounds like the use of sound or the use of onomatopoeia is what allows for there to be this this communication between the two propositions, but also their divergence from one another. which is supposed to be, I think, this law of the mirror, right? Is that you've got the old room as quite uninteresting, but everything else is as different as possible. So you've got like you've got two rooms in a sense. Gotta stop doing that. You've got two rooms in a manner of speaking, which are diverging from each other through sound.
Yeah, a lot of the transitions are marked by like a door slamming or bells ringing or a song in the distance
Yeah, that
or
makes
like a
sense.
train whistle.
I mean, I think reading this, I suspect these series, rather than being parallel, are kind of successive. So one goes into another, then one goes into another. And as you're saying, so there is this thing that marks the transition from one to the other, which is, as you pointed, as you said, Brooks, is a sound or a proposition. So it begins one series and ends in another. Proposition begins in one series and ends in another.
Excellent. All right. And we'll have a lot of time to discuss this. I want to get to the third of these, which is very pointed at the esoteric word, which is, I think, esoteric versus portmanteau. We're going to start having the discussions between things. But I still think we're still in the connective sort of nature, the and of things. Because the third method is two series propositions, or a proposition like there's a whole bunch of possibilities, but the disparities specifically between the two are regulated by this esoteric word, or I think I could just say nonsense word. The example he gives is that of fliz, fruit without taste, or azagoon pudding, as an example. These are esoteric words Carroll uses. Whatchamacallit, I think, is another that he uses later on, which is great. But these esoteric words themselves sort of become, or are, how to put it, essentially have their own meaning and reference themselves almost solely inside of the sort of literal space that they're in. But I'll leave it to everyone. If anyone has examples, mine was snozberries from Willy Wonka. Like, snozberries as a thing just feels like spot on exactly what he's talking about here. Plus a lot of other stuff from Willy Wonka, obviously. But Jabberwocky, another one I came up with was cromulent from Simpsons, which is probably one of my favorite of this kind of esoteric word. They're words that are essentially, referencing themselves inside of two series of propositions that have significant disparities. If anyone has a better way to describe this is how I understand sort of the third one of these.
Yeah, I think it's worth looking at the esoteric word in the first one. The first thing he says is that the series are characterized by a great disparity and regulated by means of an esoteric word. So that's the kind of overriding thing that I think connects these three different examples, or four. So the esoteric word first, the esoteric word second, and then the portmanteau word. I suspect that they're all in a way regulating these, again, going back to that kind of nomenclature of heterogeneous series. So I think that's the first thing. But I think in this first one, he says it's a kind of word that's it's a contraction. It's an esoteric word that's formed through contraction. And as he says, this contraction aims at the extraction of the global sense of entire proposition in order to name it a single syllable. And at the end of that paragraph, it says esoteric words of this type form a connection, a synthesis of succession, which bears upon a single series. So in this one, we're talking about one series, not two series.
Oh, that makes sense. So if you don't know the reference, I still think cromulent works for that. So cromulent's a Simpsons joke. The founder of Springfield has a sentence. His famous sentence is, a noble soul in Biggins, the smallest man. And Biggins is obviously not a real word. Someone says this, and the joke response is, and it's a great response, is, and Biggins is a perfectly cromulent word, which is phenomenal as a response and as a joke. But To me, that feels like it's a proper sort of comparison, because that's a single series. It is intended to be sort of referential unto itself. It's not referencing anything outside of it. It works only almost in that context and series in and of itself. So it works when he's talking about esoteric words that are sort of this, you know, overtly simplified version of other things that feel like it has more to it. It feels like it's a reference to that. No? Huh?
I think the difference between the esoteric word and the onomatopoeia is somehow the esoteric word must call attention to itself. As esoteric, it must be self-reflexive, because the real word can't be said. The esoteric word that we have is the name of the word that circulates as a blank space or a empty space. So if I say the splash was enormous and the cat meowed and the baby went la la or whatever, I'm using language normally. The only it doesn't call attention to itself. I call attention maybe to myself as a person of limited vocabulary or a poet. But these other ones, he gives 3 cases, but he says that the word that circulates cannot be said. We have a name for the word, but we don't have the word. So we call attention to that by a word for something that's invisible, the snark, something that's evanescent, like the fleers, something that's indeterminate, like I say, a thingamy, an aliquid, an it, whatchamacallit. That calls attention to the fact that I'm trying to say something and I'm not fully saying it. But you can understand or interpret from the context, the verbal context, or the whole physical context as well, what I'm trying to get at. And then the other is the word has no name at all. It doesn't have a single name. It can be the entire refrain of a song. So I imagine if there's something I want to say and I dare and say it, but I and I and speak for a whole paragraph, and that's to name the word that cannot be said because there's no name for it or it's not appropriate in this context. That's when we've got a case of an esoteric word, whether it's onomatopoeic or not. It's esoteric because it's saying what cannot be said. And so it's calling attention to itself as such.
Yeah, I like your take there a lot, because I think that's really important, because he's getting at what happens when 2 series of propositions have a great disparity, right? So like you're saying, right, the esoteric word, it refers to a word, but it's not the word itself, right?
Yeah.
So like even when he says the unpronounceable monosyllable, right? That's not the unpronounceable monosyllable, right? That seems to be an expression or like sense here that is being sort of captured. I don't want to say captured. It's being named, right? But it's not. The naming is not the expression itself. And this is important because when you've got this kind of disparity, right? You've got 2 series this far apart, fruits and tastelessness, for instance, right? It takes something that's so there's something connecting them, right? That's ensuring the coexistence, as he calls it. But like you're saying, right, it's got this evanescent quality where it's um, what's being expressed can only be named without actually holding the object in a manner of saying it.
So I think yeah, if we're talking about the first one is the one that relates to a single series, but if we're talking now about dual series and a heterogeneous series at that, I think what's been said. So I think the point of the esoteric word is that it doesn't refer to the series. Its job is not to kind of connect the two series. Its job is to name that which does connect the two series, but hasn't got a name in itself. So at the bottom of page 46, it's the empty square, the empty shelf, which again we had last week, the blank word. These are things that are connecting these heterogeneous series, which is called, so again, that goes back to the kind of notion of dilatation and sense. And I know it was the Garden song when he was talking about the thing, they give you that quite a complex way in which words relate to each other. So its name, then it's a name of a name, etc., etc. So here, this esoteric words function is to name the thing that connects the two heterogeneous, the two in the heterogeneous series, which themselves have no which are evanescent in themselves, don't have a kind of presence. So he talks again, the empty square, the empty shelf, the blank word. So they're called by the name.
So, okay, I'm going to keep going back and trying to find examples. There's a song by Regina Spektor called Eat that I really, really like. It's a little sappy, but I do like it. The clever part about the song is about how, as we get older, our favorite songs, we slowly actually forget the lyrics, even though we used to sing them all the time. And it's this sort of melancholy song about, just age and how the things we used to love that were defining to us, we lose over time. And the definition of this for her is the name of the song, which is Eat, and it's part of the chorus. Because really all that she remembers of these old songs is sort of the last bit of the words, which is it's beat, seat, all of that, but she just can only eat, like happens when you kind of have forgotten a song you really know. And so the song's called E-E-E-T, and it's a completely nonsense word. It's basically sort of singular in its sort of usage. It makes absolute sense in it, and it's loaded with an extraordinary amount of emotion when she sings it. Worth checking out the song, by the way. That feels like a really solid sort of use of this, because it's like at least a good example of that. Am I close?
Well, I think it would be. I'm not sure, because what the point of this esoteric word here is naming something that's not visible. So it could be. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no. That's the eat is the she's naming the thing that just like a pure emotion and the loss of it by using sort of the sound we make as we're singing along with songs we don't know anymore.
Oh yeah, got you. Yeah.
It's hard to describe because again, like a lot of this stuff, we're literally talking about things that don't have a name. So I'm trying to talk around it, but it's worth check out the song or at least the lyrics. I think I'll link the lyrics actually. Let me see if I can find them. But I think it's a good use of that.
And yeah, the final one in that section is he says the word has no name at all, so it's named by the entire refrain of a song. And he refers back to the gardener's song. The word is named by it. So if you remember that, there was two separate propositions, and I'm not sure if I call them propositions actually, but there's three elements within each verse. One is the animal, one is I think they're kind of two series, but they're very heterogeneous. And the third sense is the thing that is kind of bringing them to, not bringing them together, but kind of narrating a kind of melancholic story.
With that, we head into the fourth sort of example of this, which is the portmanteau. So the fourth of these is when we start moving into the sort of next sort of step of this, as we start playing with, I don't know, to me this is the disjunctive, as I understand it. The idea here being that we find greatly ramified series being regulated by portmanteau words and constituted, if necessary, through esoteric words of the previous kind. And then the next few paragraphs are basically fighting around this. This one, a little bit more trouble I had with being able to come up with a clever way or a quick way of being able to sort of describe this. The examples he gives very quickly, and he uses them sort of early on, is sort of saying what a portmanteau isn't. Is that fair? Like, he starts with like saying it's not these things. The first one of those examples being a snark. A snark is a portmanteau word which designates a fantastic or composite animal, the shark snake. But it is a secondary or accessory portmanteau word, since its content does not coincide as such with its function as an esoteric word. By its content, it refers to a composite animal, whereby by its function it connotes two heterogeneous series, only one of which is about an animal, albeit composite, the other about an incorporeal sense. It is not, therefore, in its portmanteau aspect that the word fulfills its function. And here's where we get to what I think, how I sort of read this series and sort of what he's driving at. Because, as I said, if you Google what a portmanteau is, there's some very simplistic definitions, and to me, he's using portmanteau the same way he's been using paradoxes, is to reveal something that's a little bit of a deeper meaning behind how sort of words work, sounds work within words, how series create words, how we sort of define and pull out meaning of various things. And portmanteau for him, I think, is in this incredibly important thing to sort of separate from these other versions that are portmanteau-y, but not literally the thing that he's talking about here. And he starts breaking that down throughout this fourth sort of setup. That's how I read sort of this last little bit.
I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I think there's an important distinction to keep in mind as he goes through these 3 pages. That's the distinction between a nominal definition, where you have a criterion for saying what the thing is you're trying to demarcate, how to recognize it. And as he concludes at the end of the chapter, the real definition, this is a thing that I think, at least in his time, kids learnt in school, and you certainly learn in philosophy. There's the nominal definition, which is okay. It lets you have a criterion of demarcation or of recognition, but it doesn't get to the essence, so to speak. And the real definition goes even further and gets at the essence of what this thing is that you've tried to isolate out. So the nominal definition is it can't be limited just to the series of words. So it can't be just a contraction like your ions. It can't be limited to having several senses, and it can't be founded by the idea that this is a way of recognizing it. You're contracting words, you're encompassing several senses, and that lets you recognize it, but you haven't said what it really is. And that's the real definition which comes after.
He makes a distinction here between portmanteaus and contractions, right?
Yes, contractions are on just one level, I think, in one series, like urines. That's a contraction. A portmanteau needs to combine several words and englobe several senses. So it needs two series, and not just in a external fashion. That's the thing about the content does not coincide as such with the function in a case such as the snark, which has a portmanteau aspect to it, but it's not its main aspect. It's more, it's got the contraction aspect, like your eyes, of combining two words, shark and snake. It's got the sense aspect because it's something evanescent. So it's working on two series at once, but these two things, the content and the function, are not intrinsically linked. And that's the further step that makes something, an esoteric word, into a portmanteau word.
But it's a combination of, so it's, I'm just going to add to that a little bit, Terrence, because I think I understand what you're saying. I'm just going to try to say it slightly differently. With a contraction, a straight contraction, like Uranus, it's the straight and connective of those words, and also their meaning. Like, I mean, they sort of come with it. Uranus is your highness. It's just, scrunched up. Portmanteau, scrunches up. It does that contraction thing. It combines, it takes parts and all of that. But it also does that with the sense of what they're trying to, the meaning of the thing. So the example that he uses of realtium, which is, I think, because he's basically saying, like, hey, well, how do we tell the differences? These things are pretty difficult. If we just say Jabberwock or we talk about snark, and it's like, look, the reality is, and the way that he explains it is, in The Hunting of the Snark, the quote from Carroll, supposing that when Pistol uttered the well-known words, under which King Benzonian speak or die, Justice Shallow felt certain that it was either William or Richard, because he's in this scene, he's got to pick which king he's loyal to, or which king is there right now. It had to be William, it had to be Richard, but gotta have a choice between the two. Gotta choose which route. And if he yelled out Realtium, technically it's both at the same time, and that's the unique part of, for him, the use of the portmanteau is that you have almost pointing at disconnected meanings, but you're combining them into the same word somehow with like, I don't want to say uniting sort of separate things, but like this is the disjunctive. This is why he uses the term disjunctive sort of throughout this. Is you're talking about sort of dividing the series, but bringing them and inserting them into themselves as well. Whereas Uranus is just purely scrunching a singular series, even its meaning.
This reminds me a lot of a kind of jokesy thing that people have been doing recently, where it's like they're presented with two particular options. The example is like, are you a boy or are you a girl? And the response is yes, as a way of just kind of like bringing the two things together into the same sense and saying that I am both at the same time. Just kind of just bringing things into it. It's not necessarily a matter of contradiction per se, as so much as it is, whether it's William or Richard. Realtium basically is a portmanteau that contains the sense of both William and Richard, but only insofar as they're united under the sense of both being the king, if I think I understand this right.
Yes, I would say that that's a sort of nice and simple case, but in appearance. But the yes has to be understood as a performative yes and not a semantic yes. If you're saying, are you a boy or a girl, and you reply yes, you're opening up a new possibility, a new disjunction that was not envisaged in the question. So you're doing more than just answering the question, you're opening up a new disjunction. So I would say, if I wanted to be really pedagogical and systematic, that for a portmanteau word, you need two series. On the series of one, two, you need two series, 1, 2. 2, you need to scrunch the words up. Usually, yes is not really scrunched up, but it's you're perverting or or transforming the yes. 3, you need to have an ambiguity, or not really an ambiguity, because if you stop with ambiguity, it's not enough. So you need multiple senses, and that those 3 make the nominal definition. With that, you can recognize portmanteau word when you see one. And 4, the deeper criterion is that it must open up a disjunction, a ramification, a bifurcation. And that's the sort of necessary and sufficient criterion once you've got the other 3.
Yeah, that's very well said, because the Rilke part works because there's on one side, on one series you have the Rick and Will, like in shorthand, or the Richard and the William, and on the other you have the William and the Richard, right? So you've got, like you're saying, you're opening up something. So with the Truman, right? It's not a portmanteau of fuming and furious. It's a portmanteau of fuming and furious plus furious and fuming, right? You've got to have the disjunctive capacity through both series for the portmanteau to perform the synthesis.
And that's where you get the Klineman. He says it, if your thoughts incline ever so little towards fuming, you'll say fuming furious. If they turn even by a hair's breadth, so these for me, incline ever so little, turn even by a hair's breadth, are expressions of the Klineman. You'll have furious fuming. And I don't know about you, but in my text, there's a misprint. But if you have that rarest of gifts, a perfectly balanced mind, you'll say, it says framius, but by the context, it must be frumious. And in the French, it's frumious. So I don't know if anybody else has that misprint. So you need that sort of disjunctive virtualization, and then the Klineman, or which can be a mental inclination, or a chance event that crops up, will make it incline one way or the other.
I think what's interesting here is how, like, with the how the portmanteau here works with frumius as the example here, the inclination and the Klineman, how that fits into here. But you also have, like, when you have this portmanteau, you pointed out earlier that with a disjunctive synthesis, you have opened up, so to speak, the kind of fields of what is possible per se. It's like you just challenging the assumptions of just one of the terms or the other, and you bring them both together, and they take on new meaning and have new dimensions to them.
Yes, this is what we saw before about the neutrality of sense, that it's between the modalities. It's neither one nor the other. It's in that neutral state, which is the exacerbation of the sterile reiteration. It's pushed logically further. That means it's neutral between different possibilities and the idea of possibility and impossibility itself.
I'm reminded actually of the inflection point in The Fold, and how he talks about the inflection point as being kind of an ambiguous point where up and down coordinate directions don't make any particular sense. And this is that kind of genetic point where the line can go any way that it wants to. And due to it not being oriented in any particular way, it can go up, it can go down. So it's really that turning point where all the possibilities kind of begin to unfold from what the direction before suggests.
Yes, it's an inflection point, but it has the 2 aspects. That's one of the 3 criteria, that it has the 2 aspects of signifying series and signified series, if you will, them at the same time that it opens up a disjunction
Yeah.
for choice or Klineman. So it's the mathematical image is a figuration of it, but it has to be in a context where you have signified and signified theories.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to get at too, is that you can't just focus on the word, right? You've got to focus on how the word is affecting two series. And in this sense, it's two series with a simultaneity, right? William and Richard on the one side, or on the one series, right? But on the other series, William and Richard on the one, and then on the other, Richard and William, right? You've got to have that that cross point. Otherwise, like with the line, that's going to get wonky because like Terrence is saying, you have to have like up down and down up for there to be this portmanteau disjunction.
Thinking also.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just gonna mention also, we go back to the earlier point about the watch and the two series themselves being kind of bridged by this strange object. It's not necessarily the object itself that's the event, I don't think, but the no, I don't think that point is very good.
Well, I think there could be some confusion with the idea of simultaneity. It's in the examples we get, because we need examples that we can understand. It's usually temporal simultaneity, but in fact it's logical simultaneity. That's why in an earlier series, when he talks about where he used the example of the purloined letter, a little later he says the two series can be successive, but viewed from the point of view of sense, they're simultaneous. So the simultaneity is not necessarily that it happens at the same time. That's what we get with the Realtrim example, but it's we at the same time, logically speaking, we must take them together.
Right, because the sense, it's kind of like the way that I was able to actually kind of parse that was just that the event itself not only like you get the second series, but that the event also looks back into the first series at the same time in order to provide the morphogenetic conditions for either series.
Well, the event is cross-eyed. And so it's looking at both, maybe not deciding, insofar as it's an event with an E, capital E, it's not deciding yet which is the past and which is the future. It's a shunting point. If anyone has seen Tenet, this is a really good example for the whole chapter, Tenet, because without spoiling anything, you have objects and people that, well, there I spoiled it. You have objects moving backwards in time, and so they have negative entropy. And then you have these shunts where you can invert the entropy or re-invert it if something is, or yourself, you have been going backwards through time. When you go back through time, it takes just as long as going forwards, but your entropy is reversed. So anyhow, the event is looking in both directions at once. It hasn't yet shunted one way or the other. That's the effectuation.
One of the things that I'd like to mention is this, where it talks about fuming furious or furiously fuming. That's an example of chiasm or reversibility, which is, for Merleau-Ponty anyway, a example of wild being, the structure of wild being.
I think the focus of this latter section is on distinguishing between esoteric words and portmanteau words, and I think that's the important thing to understand, I would say. So on page 49, I think that's, well, yeah, so we've got that quote from Hunting of the Snark. But halfway down page 49, or a third, he says the function of the portmanteau word always consists in the ramification of the series into which it is inserted. So it kind of complicates things, I would say. It has this complicating effect. And so earlier on in that page, he's talking about this difference between the Rilchium, this kind of bringing them together, and as I think we've already said, so the disjunction is not between fuming furus or furus, it's between fuming and furus on one hand, and furus and fuming on the other. So this complicates, I would say, the idea, the thing that's being said. And at the end of this page, he then Deleuze then brings these three sorts of esoteric words together. So he says there's a contracting word which should be looked at, which is the urines, which is for a single series. And then there's circulating words, which we've already looked at. And then there's this one. Contracting words. And then there's disjunctive or portmanteau words, which have this effect of bringing things together and apart at the same time. But there is one bit that's in here I was looking at as well, is that I can't find it now, but I think there is a sense of the portmanteau word naming the esoteric word in the same way that the esoteric word in the previous section we looked at, in which I was trying to find it now actually. So the esoteric word names the thing that connects the series, which are not visible, so the empty square.
I'm skeptical about whether or not this is an example of chiasmus. Just going back to what Kent was saying. Insofar as like if this is some kind of chiasmus, it's concerned with the consistency of the chiasmus that is maintained, rather than just the reversibility itself.
Say that again. I didn't understand that.
In the sense that like there's the event kind of provides there's a certain consistency and eternal consistency that allows for the transposition between two series that can potentially happen in the sense of like if you're inclined one way or the other. The event is not necessarily deciding on one or the other, and if this is a situation of chiasmus, it's only insofar as like the event sustains the two sides, so to speak, the reversal.
So the thing about chiasmus is that if there's a difference between fuming and furious and fuming, i.e., if you reverse them and there's a difference in meaning, then that's the example of sense, and that's the example of Wileby.
That makes sense.
So, as a question, so are these terms, for example, fuming, furious, and furious, fuming, are these, would we say they're portmanteau words?
So I think we've got to start talking about the syntheses here because, like, especially in this fourth one, Deleuze, I think, makes it really clear that to talk about the portmanteau versus the esoteric, you've got to focus on what it's doing, right? So Terence talked about the criteria, but there's a functionality for the portmanteau, right, that distinguishes how the snark functions in one manner and how it could function in a portmanteau manner, right? So I think we need the syntheses here if we're gonna tackle that.
To answer my question, I'd say they're probably not portmanteau words, because I think the essence of looking back, actually, portmanteau words is they contract. So they're defined by that. This is on page 47, below that, where the fourth idea is being introduced. Portmanteau words themselves esoteric. They are esoteric words, but of a new kind. They're defined by the function of contracting several words and enveloping several senses. So if you say furious, fuming, then you're not contracting, so it's not a portmanteau word. It's just a sense that's being brought into the portmanteau word. This disjunction, that's what the disjunction is about. The essence of this portmanteau word, as opposed to the esoteric word. It's a type of esoteric word, but it's not a type of the ones that we've talked about previously.
Yeah, you got to move into the functions there, right? Because what the portmanteau does that the snark doesn't, it's as an esoteric word, right? Is the snark brings together, I think it's snake and shark, right? And that has two series, right? And there's a lot going on there in terms of divergence. But the portmanteau is doing something different, right? The portmanteau is not bringing together. So if we use the frumious example, it's not bringing together fuming and furious in their divergence, right? Or the Rilke example, right? It's not bringing together Richard and William simply through their extreme divergence, right? It's bringing together the series fuming and furious as well as furious and fuming, right? And that functionality is where you get the disjunction, right? Because the two series, the synthesis is behaving differently there. So, like, for instance, with the snark, you're not changing how the shark and snake function versus the snake and shark. Oh, let me try that again. I have trouble with this. You're not changing how the snake and shark function on one series as opposed to the converse on the other, right? Since I can't keep it straight in my head. But with the portmanteau, there is a change in both series, right?
All right, so to sort of go back, unless anyone has a response directly to that, I want to kind of finish out with the conversation of what are the last handful of sentences in this, to go back to connection, conjunction, and disjunction. To just say them out, we essentially have esoteric words that work in like essentially one of three ways that they're created. One is through connective synthesis, which is occupant without a place, but they're contracting words that are distinguished from circulating words, which are conjunctive synthesis, and then portmanteau disjunctive words. Those three are sort of the way esoteric words get used as he's describing them. The first being contracting, the second being sort of circulating, semi-self-referential, essentially, and then the last being the actual portmanteau as he's defined it here, which are disjunctive. Is that not how anyone sees this? Anyone have questions there? It's worth discussing on. I think finishing on that point, because again, this feels like a lot of this is sort of throwing in very early efforts at what will become how they talk about in Anti-Oedipus, and now a new thing I have to find and read. If anyone, by the way, finds the piece that Terrence was talking about earlier, let me know, post it up. Thoughts, opinions?
I think that's good, except we must bear in mind that there are different senses of the syntheses, and in particular, the disjunctive. There are different uses, maybe is a better way of saying it. And the disjunctive
inclusive versus exclusive, you mean?
What there? So here, the Wiltshire is an example of the poor person pistol under the threat of death leaps to the point of the inclusive disjunctive synthesis with Wiltshire. So there is a disjunction, and yet somehow they're held together in a way that's not the same as a conjunction. And that's why you need a new word for that, and that's inclusive. So it's an inclusive disjunction.
Does he give an example of a portmanteau specifically that is the exclusive disjunction? Is that the snark, or?
Well, I don't think that would be a degenerate form. So maybe the snark, I don't know, I would have to analyze it from that point of view. But strictly, the portmanteau must be an example of an inclusive disjunction.
Okay, cool. That's what I was kind of getting at. Is a portmanteau always an inclusive disjunction, which seems to be the case, at least here.
Once you get to the real definition, it ramifies, so it creates a branch or two branches of a disjunction, and affirms both of them in their distance. That's what he says later on in the appendix on Klosowski. That's what he always says whenever he talks about it elsewhere. So that's a first example of it.
Yeah, and I think the snark is conjunctive rather than disjunctive.
Yes, I agree.
Unless it were to function in a disjunctive sense. And that would be the trick, because Deleuze doesn't give an example of that functionality of snark, right? He's very clear that it doesn't have the portmanteau function because it's not shark and snake and shark.
Maybe when the snark is a bujum, because it has a consequence on both planes, on the linguistic plane and on the physical plane of death, if you were to call it death, of dissipation of identity. But it still seems external. It's not. The content is not fully coinciding with the function even then.
Yeah, because Bujum puts it back into the zoology he's talking about earlier on, right?
Except for the fact that it dissipates your identity. You just have to come across it, encounter it, and you softly and silently vanish away. It doesn't eat you. It doesn't have to do anything. It's just a disjunction so powerful that your identity is dissipated. but then you have maybe you're failed in your synthetic functions.
Yeah, I mean, even there, I'm thinking of like, in one final example, we must point out that an esoteric word subsuming to a heterogeneous series is not necessarily a portmanteau, right? And it kind of sounds like we're getting at, because you're talking about like there's still an event, right? There's still, but it sounds like we're still kind of going back to like that evanescence. So I don't know, maybe we're even going back to like a divergence there.
Yeah, I think the key I'm trying to get my head around this portmanteau word is its disjunctive nature, as opposed to the esoteric word, which is conjunctive. I think that seems to be the key, that its function to kind of unjoin series which are together, being brought together, has this element of disjunctive. And because of this, it says at the bottom of page 49, performs an infinite ramification. So it's an infinite ramification. So it has that effect of, it doesn't bring it to a close. It doesn't make it consumable as something that one can take in. It's just, it seems to give off endless meanings. So that quote from Michel Bouteau, he says, who talks about, I take it to talk about the middle of page 49, take it to talk about portmanteau words. Each of these words can act as a switch, and we can move from one to another by means of many passages. Hence the idea of a book which does not simply narrate one story, but a whole ocean of stories. And this, I suspect Deleuze would read with approval, because one of his ideas about modernism is that it has this notion, has this capacity to narrate lots of different stories at one time. So the portmanteau word seems to be doing that. It seems to be setting up a ramification in the series. So by necessity, the meanings are kind of ramified. They're kind of constantly being branched off.
Well, and the use of sounds and words in the discussion here, I can't help but, like, I kept trying lines last night, and I continue to while we're talking. One of the symptoms of schizophrenia is called schizophagia, the inability for someone to respond to a sentence or have the conversation using words that themselves make sense, but somehow when you listen to someone who's actually suffering from it, like, the words that they are using are related to the things. It's kind of like a sort of overblown version of this hyper-connective sort of, connecting meaning and doing this, but instead of a single word, it's the entire sentence or an entire paragraph. And it just feels like, again, when we're pointing at, the next few works from Deleuze and the direction this is going, such things just popped into my head as, interesting sort of asides of how this sort of surfaces in different places. Schizophagia is incredibly fascinating, the studies on it.
Yeah, then, sorry, I'm just going back to that page 49, just before that Michel Bouteau quote. And he says, every series is already ramified in principle and still further ramifiable. So again, it's this kind of opening up the series. As I think up to now, it's been seen as something that is ordered. It can be meaning for, they have a relationship to each other. I think Deleuze is giving quite an ordered understanding of the structure of the series, how two series will work together. And now I think he's beginning to talk about how they said they're ramifiable, so they become more and more disruptive and have this capacity to kind of generate more and more meanings.
All right. I think we've made it through the entire thing. Is there anything we want to go back to, larger points we want to start making as we sort of close this out? Because this has been a fantastic discussion, and I don't know how much I have to add necessarily at this point. So I'll leave it open for a moment. But it's I really like, to me, the point of this is going through the nature of how these nonsense words inside of Carroll, and nonsense words that are sort of brought up or used all the time, different, the specific words that are in there, how we build them, slamming words together in contractions, finding words that are sort of self-referential and clever inside of their usage. But a portmanteau is kind of that next step, a word from two series that derives meaning and makes sense within the context of those series, both somehow not being directly connected to either of them, but also signifying both of them at the same time. And it's a really interesting breakdown of these nonsense words that I really enjoyed. Because, I think he's using portmanteau as a way of sort of pointing at how meaning is sort of derived in almost any word, but he's using portmanteau as sort of that thing for us to sort of break down and utilize.
Well, I think there's something that ought to be mentioned, which is that this seems to be the source of the three syntheses of the unconscious in Anti-Oedipus that we spent so much time with reading that book.
Yeah, I'd be a little cautious trying to tie them together at this point, though, because I mean it seems really nascent to try and do that.
Well, I mean, I think it's nascent, but I don't think it's, one second, I'm gonna sneeze. It's nascent, but I don't think it's too early. I mean, it's specifically the three are the and versus the or versus, they're very spot on in terms of how the unconscious operates, how we place the partial objects and the sounds that they elicit together, and how we sort of generate them feels like it's kind of a straight line. When we talk about this to, say, Spinoza, which I believe Deleuze's Spinoza was written to came out right after this, followed by Anti-Oedipus. Like, we have those 3 points. It's a pretty straight line between this to that at that point.
Yeah, but I caution just because the words are the same, right? The functionalities seem to differ quite a bit so far.
How?
Well, for one, when Anti-Oedipus is happening, right, we're talking about the unconscious in terms of its autopoiesis in a larger social context, right? So even when we're talking about partial objects, right? Deleuze and Guattari don't take as much pains to go into propositions there, although you might be able to work out some of them. But even like in terms of what the body without organs is doing, in terms of distribution and that, like I don't see that in the series. Maybe it'll happen later on, but the functionality seems a little different.
To me, I see the functionality as, so I'll go on a limb. I see it as almost identical. I see it as a slightly different word usage, and this being kind of an early version. But when we talk about the body without organs and how things are stored upon it, which are partial pieces of responses from desiring machines as they disconnect, reconnect, shitting out things on the BWO, they're creating essentially the series. Like, it's the series us, the BW, the body itself, the body without organs. The series is being created, and all these little pieces are there. And if we go and we like grab handfuls of them, it's like, oh, we grab and. That's our connective syntheses. That's actually right here, where we're just taking the entire series. You know, we're contracting it and we're slamming it together to create sort of singular meaning and representation, but we're doing it with all of these pieces. The second part is the conjunctive, the disconnective of the entire thing. When we're sitting there, we're going, it's all these pieces, but you know, there's some other bit, and we're kind of creating something a little bit new, a little bit different, with you know the pieces between them, as he would say inside of this, the coordinations of two disconnected series. That's the conjunctive. And then the third is the disjunctive, which is the portmanteau words, sort of the creation of sort of a secondary sense that sort of elevates and connects all of those things, which to me is the subject. But how does the portmanteau word have meaning? How does the word, which I think they use in Rilchium, like that doesn't exist on its own. It requires absolutely a subject to have witnessed it as a sentence. Like that's a thing that had to happen. A person had to have read it in that order, and we, by bringing those series together, are able to define that meaning. So this to me is an early version of it, but it's not exactly like wildly off.
I don't know if I agree. I think the uses are different.
Well, I mean, literally they are, in the sense that one is talking about the unconscious, the other is talking about words. But the process, like that's, to me, the same thing. We're talking about how our, you know, intellect, our world, our subject makes sense of these things. It's with the and, how we're able to make sense of the connective sort of slamming together of words. Uranus as a thing, don't as another one, or other, like there's a lot of really interesting words that have sort of utilized contraction in order to generate some other secondary thing. Then the second bit, which is kind of semi-nonsense words that become a thing, that sort of have their own because they're circular and they have that sort of secondary thing. Again, I think it's not crazy to talk about them as being the same in terms of how the process operates. It's just a level or two above, or that's how I see it, at least.
Well, here we're leaving the singular text and we're trying to do a effectuate a synthesis of Deleuze's path of writing and thinking. I would say, this is just my feeling, that this book looks really linguistic, at least for a very large number of chapters, and Anti-Oedipus looks really machinic. In both cases, Deleuze says you need both sides, which later will be formalized in the notion of assemblage, which is in 1,000 Plateaus, which he calls the idea, the concept of an assemblage, as he's using it, is a linguistic assemblage of an enunciation, or a collective assemblage of an enunciation, and a machinic assemblage of desire. But I think in each case, he's sort of saying, what interests me, I'm taking language and literature and philosophy of language and literature, but what interests me is the logic, but I can't get at it without the language. And then this logic can be applied to psychoanalysis, and he'll use that in Anti-Oedipus to highlight what in psychoanalysis he looks on favorably as productive, and what he looks on unfavorably as not productive or no longer productive. And because, I mean, it's not a formal logic, so when he applies his logic to a different domain, he has to modify it because it's not a fixed and formal system. but still his focus is logic. And so that's what makes it possible for, after Anti-Oedipus, to go on to Mille Plateau, where he says at the beginning in Rhizome, we've talked a lot about psychoanalysis, maybe even too much, but rest assured, we will talk about it less and less, and we'll stop talking about it. Which prophecy or which promise is respected in the book itself. And then in the cinema books, you can see the relation to logic of sense, but there's no reference to psychoanalysis at all. And you can see, similarly, what is philosophy is very close to logic of sense, although he changes things around, he changes the definitions and so on. So the feeling that it's the same thing comes from the fact that his principal focus is this new logic. And the feeling that it's different is the logic is not a formal, that is to say, transcendent logic that can be instantiated anywhere just the same. It's an immanent logic. So there's a family resemblance from book to book. And I would say not just a family resemblance the way Wittgenstein says, but a very close family resemblance, but it's not exactly the same.
Yeah, and the reason I'm taking the pains here too is like Anti-Oedipus, kind of what you're hinting at. Like we can see, I think you're right that what he's working out here does affect his later work, but I don't think we should minimize what Guattari is bringing to those tests either, because that changes a lot, right? I mean, in terms of production and machinic, like you're saying. But even with the syntheses and how they function, I think
I'm absolutely not discounting at all Guattari, like in any way. This is to me, and again, I think with Guattari's writing, you could make the same comparison, where their earlier stuff, you can absolutely point to the later things and go, well, obviously this is what he's trying to say, he just doesn't understand it yet. And the same is true of both of them. And I think the combination of the two is what enabled them to actually get the shit out and actually have the conversation. But I'm not discounting Guattari. But I am saying the three syntheses here, like it's not like it's some weird coincidence that, hey, look, he's got the three syntheses. One's connective, one's conjunctive, one's disjunctive, and that they kind of operate in linguistics this sort of same exact way. Yes, we're talking about different layers of things, but like we're talking here about making sense of stuff and how we make sense of things. And I don't think it's wild to say that's like kind of unconscious-y, or the discussion of that. Again, I'm not discounting Guattari at all. I think if I were to say, hey, some of Guattari's writings, you can see this absolutely, this is a dotted line like straight into Anti-Oedipus or Mille Plateau. I don't think that's crazy to say either, and that doesn't discount Deleuze.
Well, this is where it's exciting to read the text that I put up, which came out in 1970 in Arc magazine, which had a special, what do you call it, a special number, a special issue on Kosowski. And so we don't have all the intermediate texts, so we don't know. But I would say we've got in the appendix to Logic of Sense, we've got the article on Kosowski, which is really informative. Well, there's lots of stuff that is specifically on Kosowski, but that's where he really traces out the syntheses, and he really goes into more detail than he's given anywhere else, the origins of the syntheses in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. So he lays it out philosophically, abstractly, although embedded in this hyper-rich literary, philosophical-literary analysis of Kosowski. Then he's sort of taking it over for himself here in this book, which is published in 1969. And then these two things, when comes the very next year, although we can say probably Logic of Sense was written in 1968 before May 68, basically. And then 1 or 1.5 years later, he's writing with Guattari, and they're taking over the same things, but the tonality and the domain of application are radically different.
And this is where I even feel a little strange, because to me it's less about the three syntheses in both books and more about expression and sense.
But that's what introduces a new logic.
Exactly.
That's a
and
question of emphasis.
Exactly, and I think that's, to me, that's the motive, or like the idea that's going to push through a lot of this. Is, to me, it's less the syntheses and more how they relate to expression and sense, which is, to your point, changing the way we understand the unconscious, right?
Yes, Deleuze is not a logician. He's not going to do a logic just for its own sake. So you're right there. It's the problem that dictates, or dictates is a strong word, that has a strong influence on the mode of thought that is deployed. And he's saying, wait a second, there's this sense thing. I can show it to you in language. I can show it to you in literature. I can show it to you in mathematics, and so on. And it requires something different than the ordinary standard extensional logic that's been developed in the West. And then in Anti-Oedipus, he can say it's not an application, it's an encounter with the unconscious that he deals with in Logic of Sense, but the encounter with the unconscious in a more full-blown form is part of the encounter with Guattari at the same time. And there's this new exploitation and transformation of the new logic that he's putting forward.
Yeah, and I think too, the thing that strikes me, and the reason I focus on expression there, and he mentions this, and I think it was the fifth, otherwise the sixth paradox, right? Is he makes a point about ethics, which I believe is referencing Spinoza's ethics, but he talks about taking care of the sense, right? And I think this.
Oh yes, in 2 of the series, he's talking about care. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's care towards sense, which I think is going to play into these syntheses. But more fundamentally, when Foucault calls Anti-Oedipus a book of ethics, right, the ethics toward the unconscious and and the unconscious is self-production. I suspect, and this is why I focus on expression, not just the syntheses. I suspect that ethics is tied up in expression more directly.
Well, yes, even the example, I mean, it's present all the time, but even in the example of Rilke, we've got, it's a life or death situation. If it was just somebody in a salon making a pun, it wouldn't be a portmanteau word. We're opening up a disjunction between life and death at the same time. If he says the wrong word, he dies, the wrong name. So this question of ethics and the sorts of binds and double binds that can plunge us into are ever present from the very beginning of the text. I would say, I was just thinking about that today, that whether you like it or not, because it's sort of seemingly a miserabilist terminology, but I think becoming on any becoming on once it's elevated to the pure becoming is a wound. It's the present is escaped, avoided, and the becoming is sort of the ripping apart under the aegis of infinite identity of the becoming on the surface. So he's going to say that later. He's going to give other examples, but the wound is a sort of, and later he'll say the battle, almost the exemplars of the event. So the ethics is there from the beginning. He's taking us into it slowly by means of seemingly just language. But He's talked about care as well twice. And some of his examples, including the Carroll ones, including the hunting of the snark and the Wiltshire, have life or death disjunctions within them, and it's no accident.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm gesturing toward your point about the wounding, right? There's woundings happening in being here, right? Or even if we go back to his point about like the homogeneous categories. Like last week we talked about the Whitehead and Russell test, right? There's woundings in those categories on that, which to me strikes at a lot of ethics in the normative sense, right? That strikes at virtue ethics, that strikes hard into a lot of deontology, right? And obviously, utilitarianism. But this is one of the things that really interests me about his work is as he's working through expression, right? And we can talk about like the Spinozian ethics there, but as he's working through expression and becoming, right, and he's talking about how in the event an objective structure of it is Alice's disidentity, right? These are things that I don't think those normative theories can really deal with because they're working through being, right? It's particularly categorical instantiations of it, right? They don't really have this engagement with the series in that. And this is where I think it gets really interesting because as Deleuze is working this out, right, we're seeing how words and words and things function ethically, and how even something like meaning to me, like I'm very careful about how I use it in these conversations because it can't go back toward like that kind of engagement, right? Its meaning's got to be an expression, and that in and of itself seems to be an ethical point to me.
Yes, otherwise you're just focused on the words and you become nitpicking, for example. If you're not looking at the sense, it's so easy to be nasty and nail someone to their words and dispose of them that way, for example. If you look at the sense, the expression that the words are part of, it's a different sort of way of listening, and it involves a taking care of them in terms of the sense that they're expressing. You're taking care of the sense, and so you're taking care of them, not in their frozen out, signifying identity, but in terms of these events that can resonate on different levels. You can't get rid of the wound, but you can make it resonate at a different level instead of effectuating itself in a psychosomatic way. You can, by taking care of the sense with somebody, make it resonate in a more social or intellectual or artistic or creative way. So I think those dimensions are there from the very beginning.
So one of the bits of analysis I read on this that I kind of liked and I wanted thoughts on because I have a couple people here. Someone posted, and I have no idea who because I've not been able to find out who actually posted these thoughts. But the idea that traditionally how the ordinary path of disjunction sort of follows connective, conjunctive, disjunctive. Esoteric words reverse that. Because they begin with inclusive disjunctions. The ordinary path, necessarily because it ends with essentially an either or, becomes an exclusive disjunction. This reversal of going from disjunction, ramification, to conjunction, which is coordination, and then to contraction and connection, reverses sort of that path and brings about the inclusive disjunction. Is that interesting, or is this far off?
Are you saying that they're somehow linked? They're in a series themselves. Is that what you're saying, Brooks?
I am not saying very much right now. I'm reading a thing that I'm not sure I fully grasp. So let me start there. I'm not saying very much or making an argument. I think, yes, this is what it sounds like a little bit, but the specific thing is this is about synthesis versus analysis almost. I'll just read it directly. Esoteric words reverse the path of ordinary disjunction. The ordinary path is connection, if then, conjunction, and disjunction, or. But there are two types of disjunction, exclusive and inclusive. The ordinary path leads to exclusive disjunctions. Path of esoteric words begins with inclusive disjunctions. First you have disjunction, which ramifies the sentence that they're in. Then conjunction, which is a coordination between two disparate series, and then connection, which is contraction and sort of rams them together. This is it's a reversal of how we derive meaning from the propositions, essentially.
It seems very overly complicated, I must say, because I think Deleuze is trying to, at the end, he's been quite clear, I think, in saying there are three sorts of esoteric words: contracting, circulating, and portmanteau, disjunctive or portmanteau words.
But the way he seems to be describing them, so this is why this is interesting to me and how I connect it. Just let me real quick. The three types of esoteric words as he goes through them, overall, are what I think. If I were to say the word portmanteau and ask for people to define it, all of these things are things people will use as examples, and I've seen it online. All of these things are that. So for him, like the use of esoteric words and the way that we derive meaning from it comes in a different place than the traditional setup, the traditional like non-esoteric word setup, which is we have the same syntheses inside of all of that sort of help us derive the meaning between how the different series play out. This is what we kind of went through in the serialization series. We talk about how two series get put together, homogeneous versus heterogeneous, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the sort of normal setup for that is that we start with the connective, we move to conjunctive, and then disjunctive, and it becomes an or. That's how we derive meaning from the signifier inside of any specific sort of sentence. If we reverse that, which is what esoteric words do, because to him it's, yeah, sure, there's this one type of esoteric word, which is Uranus, which is a contraction. That's like the simplest version of that. If we want to talk about like surface effects, if we want to dive a little bit deeper, we have words that are the conjunctive, which is the ones that bear upon sort of disparate series. And then we have the final, which is the portmanteau, which is the ramification of coexisting series, and it bears at once upon the words and senses. But we have to start when we make sense. We start with the esoteric word and work our way back. The sentence, he would have gasped out reulcium as a thing, like that word is where we have to start with. Whenever we've got an esoteric word, we have to start there, and then sense kind of flows out from there. And it starts with an inclusive disjunction because we know it's a combination of those things, and it moves to conjunction, which is the coordination of two separate, continually diverging series. But it is a combination and a smashing together in the connective. And so it is a reversal of how we find meaning if we start with, because we have to start with the esoteric word. I'm sure I'm overcomplicating. It's what I do, but it feels like there's something interesting there.
Well, for me, I don't know, but it seems like a misunderstanding because I think the three forms of the esoteric words are not the same. They have very different functions. In fact, he says the first one, which is a contraction, is not the typical. Is not the one that characteristic of Carroll. So that's one that's separate from that. The second one has this notion of naming the kind of naming the thing that denotates, naming the denotation, the name, the empty square. So it names the empty square. That's its function. It's not the empty square. It's not the. The circulating word. The things between the two series, it's a circulating word, which in the esoteric word have the character of being evanescent and not being present. And the things like the empty square, the empty shelf, which we saw last week, they're named by the esoteric word. So like things like it, that those kind of words which are in themselves and don't sort of name anything, they don't define anything, they're indeterminate. And then the final one has this disjunctive function of ramifying the series, has a completely different function, I would say. So I think each one of them.
I'm not disagreeing with that. I think let me add, because I'm not disagreeing with any of that, but I don't think it's necessarily that they are three separate holy things, but instead he's diving through when we talk about the connective, Uranus, which is the thing people will absolutely say is a portmanteau. He goes, but it's only the connective. It's like we can't, like, there's no meaning there. It's only the connective. There's no meaning derived deeper than that. It's not anything more than just a connection. In order to find more, we have to, in order for us to grok what realtium means, the word realtium is not like a meaning unto itself. It's not a pure contraction. It's not like Uranus. So that's the first layer. The second layer is when we have these two separate series, and that's another layer. But here still, this isn't deep enough because this is only sort of self-referential, and it's across these two things, but it doesn't ramify the entire set of series or the sentence that I'm in. Realtium goes one step further. Realtium is actually a thing that we have to start with literally grokking in that moment and making sense and having sense developed in that moment, that it is ramifying the sentences that came before and the specific sentence it's in, and it does those other things as well. If there's a topology to these things, like a pyramid, it's like, yeah, sure, at the top we've got all of these portmanteaus that do this, but only a few do this, but also only a fewer do this. And this is the one that's really interesting because it's where we grok actual interesting sort of secondary knowledge out of it. And by sort of having us work our way back, it's an inclusive disjunction versus the reverse, which would be if the sentence just had a normal fucking word there. He would have gassed out Steve. That signifier itself goes the other direction, because the first thing that we have to do with that in order to grok it is we have to then do our connective part where we see, does it match any of the other signifiers inside of anything else, the sentences, and the either or, essentially, the if then, pretty quick. Then we have to go through the conjunctive and figure out how it's matching those meanings and what it's doing as far as relation to manifest or other parts of the proposition. And then the third part, which is the disjunctive, where we have to place it into the or. It's Stephen. Stephen is the thing. It's or and fitting, and it's sort of continuing to divide. That's, to me, it's a topology of understanding of sense, and he's using portmanteaus in this very specific way to say, like, look, this is actually the sort of, if we're diving in and out of bodies and layers or whatever fucking thing we want to say, this is how I'm understanding that.
Yeah, I think in the final one, there is that idea of the having two ideas in your head, which are disjunctive, which are brought together. It's that's its nature, his disjunctive, and it's endlessly, from that endlessly ramifying.
It's inclusively disjunctive, because it's two ideas that like are together. Realtium is both William and Richard in one, whereas if it was Steve, that's Steve. That's not two ideas. That's the splitting off and further division, the or. Actually, a better example would be if I just said, if that sentence ended, he gassed out William. He's saying William versus Richard. That's the disjunctive. How we make sense of the word William in that is we go, excellent. With blah, 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 that becomes sort of by nature an exclusive disjunction. But if we say, but it goes the other direction if we have realtium. It changes how we sort of make sense.
No, I think what happens when you say, if you said William, then it would end. That would be the end of it. Whereas realtium, it gives two different directions you can go in. And this is about the infinite ramifications. It's about it opens up possibilities for other directions to go in. It's not one, it's not the other, it's the two brought together. There might be, they're disjunctive, but they're brought together. And what do you do with that? There is a sense of it opening up, again, this endless, this infinite ramification. So it has this very active element to it, where I think the previous two have a kind of more stable end to it. They have a kind of sense of finality almost, I would say, perhaps, to them. And again, this is why I think Deleuze is interested in this notion of the portmanteau word, because it, for him, from what I've read of him writing about modern art and modernism, he think the character of it is that it's very kind of, it can tell endless stories. It has different, it's not just one thing, it's lots of different things being are being generated within the thing itself. The actual thing generates something. It's a genesis of something.
I don't see how what I'm saying is disagreeing with that. If anything, what I'm trying to say is something that bolsters that heavily, that the way a normal sentence is written, it does not have a portmanteau, is it naturally becomes an exclusive disjunction at the end. The nature of him responding William is, like you said, it's where it ends, because it starts with the connective and it ends at the disjunctive, which makes it exclusive. Rilchium does the opposite. By ending with Rilchium, which is a portmanteau, it starts with the disjunctive, which is a combination of the two, and naturally, therefore, instantly inclusive. And we define meaning out the other direction. And it's actually saying what you're saying, but I'm talking more about the literal immanent process that happens inside of the actual grokking or making the sense making of the entire proposition. I think I'm agreeing with you, is what I'm saying.
Okay.
The way I'm hearing you, Brooks, is that you're trying to sort of lay out like a path, a pedagogical path, or a psychoanalytical path, or a schizoanalytical path, and you're saying that these other syntheses don't get you to sense, and it's when you get the full-fledged portmanteau word and the inclusive disjunction that your inside sense and the sort of apprenticeship that opens up, the ramified paths of sense that open up. And I can sort of agree with you. I don't think there is a privileged entry point, because the nuance between an exclusive and an inclusive disjunction can be subtle. So my personal interpretation of Anti-Oedipus is that you start with the connective synthesis, but in fact you don't realize that it's ramified. It's not just a linear thing. It's various branchings of lines of connection that you can take. But because you're just connecting, you're not seeing that. So maybe you're right to say that the disjunctive is underlying it all, because that's what lays out the pathways on the body without organs. Then you get, the way they develop it is second, you get the disjunctive synthesis. And that's your getting to this underlying ramified grid. And then, surprisingly, they end up with the conjunctive synthesis, which is the subject, which is no longer the individual, is this circulating object or proposition that circulates over all the disjunctions and extracts a surplus value of enjoyment. This is me. And I would say that in a certain sense, to ensure that your disjunction is inclusive and not exclusive, you need to sort of apply the conjunctive synthesis. The fact that you could join the disjuncts makes it an inclusive synthesis. So you could see it in that order as well. So I don't think, except for ordinary pedagogical purposes of laying out the distinctions, that the disjunctive synthesis is going to be the key doorway into sense. And once you're inside sense, anyhow.
I just
Sorry.
want to say I'm apparently having a great deal of trouble sort of getting my point across, so I'll just stop because it's not like I'm not disagreeing with you either. Like, so apparently I'm saying something wrong, and I should just shut the fuck
Not
up.
wrong. You're
No, I
producing
am,
a
because if
sequence.
I'm unable to communicate it, obviously I'm saying something wrong. What I'm saying, or the thing I'm trying to point at, may not be wrong, but the words I'm using for sure fucking are.
Well, that's why I'm agreeing and disagreeing with you at the same time. Because you seem to be saying that you have to commence with the
Nope.
disjunctive synthesis.
Nope.
No? Okay.
No, because I'm saying that it doesn't matter. What I'm saying is not getting across. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to stop because I think I'm having a secondary discussion. I don't think it's necessary or privileging sense in one direction or the other. It's to me, it's a weird thing he's specifically pointing out over the course of this, that it doesn't matter. I'll figure out a way to write it better and have this discussion later. It's not, for some reason, it's not getting across, and I'm sorry.
Well, just to look at that disjunct. I mean, I'm looking again at bottom of page 49, and he talks about disjunctive or portmanteau words, and I think the disjunctive. I mean, I might be getting this wrong. See, I think the disjunctive is within the word itself, so it brings these two things together. So Wiltshire. But here, sorry, this is just perhaps a side note. Really, they perform an infinite ramifications of coexisting series. Now, I take that to mean it's not. The previous ones have been to do with heterogeneous series. No, I don't know. I'm just wondering what that coexistence, because in the other two he talks about heterogeneous, and now suddenly just saying coexisting, but they could be heterogeneous or they could be homogeneous or homogeneous. Sorry, just a point. I'm just sort of, because I think for me the point of this, for me the in terms of the book Logic of Sense, is that I think I've said this before. I think the whole book is a series. It's written as a series, and I think the analysis of the series. So last week serialization, this week how Lewis Carroll creates series and his use of esoteric and portmanteau words to regulate these series. And I think next, I'm just kind of looking ahead next week again, we're looking at series. So I think for me that's the important focus internally to this book.
All right, with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and close this out because I just want to continue to have this debate, and it's not going to work. I need to spend some time thinking through how I word some of this. Any last questions or comments before we head off and end our session here? Before I do that, I'll take that as a no. As always, thank all of you for joining us today. It's phenomenal. I love these discussions, and it's super important stuff. And I think it's I'm going to find a way to think through what I'm saying, Terrence and Derek, and I will find a way to communicate it properly to you at some point. It could be not in our lifetimes, but we'll figure it out.
Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you guys. Thanks everyone so much. And I'll see you guys next time. Next Monday, same time. See you then.